Pastor Anderson covered that a couple weeks ago. And just as a reminder, there's a handout on the back that's kind of a 2 to 3 page handout on a bunch of information that he covered. So if you want to grab that, feel free. We talked about Scientology, did a little quick aside on Rastafarianism, and it was a fun little one. You guys went and looked up about that, about Prince Rastafari. There's a funny story I didn't mention when we talked about that, which is because I told you he became the king of Ethiopia, and the name he took was Haile Selassie, which means might of the Trinity, and he himself was a Christian. But they still, even though he, said, I am not God, please do not worship me as God, they continued to worship him as God. And he even made a visit to Jamaica, and it just kind of worked out that they had a bit of a drought there, and on the day his plane landed, they had rain. He was like, oh no, I'm going to take this as a sign, and they're going to keep calling me God. And so any questions, kind of maybe lingering over, especially from last week when we talked about Scientology? Happy to. Yes, Adam.
Not Scientology, but specific. We don't talk about this today, but maybe towards the end of the cult series.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love if we could talk about the Roman Catholic perception of cults, meaning they kind of seem to go like, hey, the Reformation and sola scriptura is the primary cause of all the cults and all these things.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And are you saying that for a particular reason? Are you speculating that might be what they say, or did you see something that made you think that?
They do say that. I don't think it's an official position.
Okay.
Anyone who's like a Catholic apologist makes that a talking point.
Okay.
It's almost like you know them by their fruits kind of argument. And
Yeah.
the fruits of the Reformation.
Yeah.
They point to all these cults and denominations, etc.
See, that's the part. I've heard it applied to the denominations. I've never heard it applied to cults, though. So that's why I was curious if you'd seen something specific.
I've always heard it with the denominations.
Yeah.
It's a more recent thing where they said, and also.
It could be, and it could be a natural extension of it. Like, yeah, all these denominations and then cults. And what's interesting is one of the things we saw, and might come up today, is there's a desire on the part of many to have just an authoritative spokesman. Just tell me what to believe. Like, tell me what to think about these things, right? Pope, tell me what to think, prophet of God, in Mormonism, tell me what to think. And you're going to see really the same thing in Jehovah's Witnesses, which I guess in one way I could understand why you'd find it appealing, right? Just make things simpler, right? It's like we have these debates about a verse and say, oh, we don't have to spend all this time working through it and doing all the hard work of, exegesis and hermeneutics. Let's just go to this guy and just tell us which one's right. And he tells you, like, oh, that was easy, right? So, unfortunately, I'm not even going to say unfortunately. I don't think it's not unfortunately, that's not the case. We might desire that in some respects, but I think that runs into a lot of the same problems that the arguments that Muslims will use against the Bible, and the way that we have all the various manuscripts of the scriptures to help us understand what the original said. And some people view that as a negative, like, man, couldn't we just have the one book that fell down and we've just had it this whole time? And I've argued before in Sunday schools that that's actually not good, because then it would be, we have other arguments against God, not preserving his scriptures, but just on a practical level, how would you know that book wasn't changed if it was just one, right? It'd be much easier to change that than it would be hundreds of thousands of manuscripts spread all over the Mediterranean world, and someone somehow gathering all those up, changing them, redistributing them without anybody knowing about it. That's the level of when people say the Bible's changed, it's do you know what the process of how we got the Bible? And I think I've mentioned before conversations I've had like that with people, and there was one guy in particular who made that claim. He had just read the Da Vinci Code, and he made this claim, and I asked him, I said, hey, are you familiar with how we got the Bible? And then kind of walked him through that, and I said, do you think that a group could do something like that? He's like, no, that's not possible. I was like, all right, there you go. So that's an interesting question, though. It'd be good to look into. Anything else? Particularly on Scientology, since that's what we covered last week, but it could be other things. Yes.
One of the questions I asked last week was if they had a group gathering.
Mm.
Is it not particularly? So how do they spread? Like how do they evangelize?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the only I said they don't have a group gathering and like we have a weekly worship service, something like that. As far as I know, and again, I'm not an expert in Scientology, so maybe they do. They do have their big gatherings, which I think you can see some of those online actually. They spread. I think the primary means is through what I mentioned last week, which is like I guess I'd almost call them like quasi counseling personality tests kind of things. Like, hey, you meet someone, they're struggling, they're addicted to drugs, their life's not going anywhere. You say, hey, you know what? I've done this thing that's kind of helped me. It's like this little kind of, it's a personality test. It's an easy way. That doesn't sound so bad. Personality test, that's kind of cool. I can do that, right? If you come in and say, hey, come into this thing, we're going to measure your engrams and try to remove them from your thetans. They're like, what? Like nobody's going to come in for that. But when it's put kind of a little bit softer, I think that's, from my understanding, that's how a lot of people are introduced to it. And then what happens is if you have a practical effect in your life, then now that has a psychological hold on somebody, right? Because if they don't have really sound arguments for what they believe, or they're not even really interested in that kind of stuff, but they might say, look, all I know is this works for me. Look, I was this way, I started doing these things, now I'm this way. What else do you want? That's what I'm looking for. So I believe that's one of the main ways. And it's still relatively small, too. I think only numbers maybe around 1 million people.
Building on that, I was actually in Pasadena one time. Alyssa and I were walking around, and there's a big Scientology center there. And as we walked past, it was kind of a hot summer day. The doors were open, and they had the AC blasting, and it felt so good. And there was a guy out front asking that question, hey, have you ever had a personality test done?
Was there, he did. He said that, actually? Okay, there you go.
That's how they get you inside.
Yeah.
And it was kind of tempting for the AC. I might maybe just stand there for a second.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what they did. Was they would just offer you a free personality test.
Yeah, that's good. It's interesting that you heard that exact phrase. It's confirmation. Okay. All right, well then let's move on. Today I wanted to talk kind of a brief overview of Jehovah's Witnesses. This is probably, after Mormonism, maybe the second largest cult. Numbering, you hear somewhere around maybe like 4 million, probably fluctuates here and there. Strongly into proselytizing, not the same way the Mormons do. They don't do like a 2-year mission in the way the Mormons do, but you will see often groups, if you see, 2 to 3 people well-dressed, men wearing suits, women wearing, long dresses, sitting down with a kind of a rack with a bunch of pamphlets and material next to them. That's probably Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, they will go sometimes door to door in neighborhoods, and usually they have like some sort of briefcase or something with them because they have, again, a lot of written material. I don't know if it's still true, but at one time I think they were the largest producer of written material, books, and pamphlets in the entire world. I think it's still pretty high. Some insane number like 1 million booklets and pamphlets a day were being produced by them. That's a big part of their evangelism. If you ever, I remember at one apartment complex we used to live in, I'd always go in there to the laundry room, and there's always this little. It almost looks like a comic book sized thing, but it's like very thin paper, and it says Watchtower on the top. If you ever see anything like that, that's from the Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, that's just their main publication, or one of their main publications. Okay, so question is, let's talk a little bit about their beliefs and where they come from. So they were began by a man in the late 1800s, Charles Taze Russell, when he was about 18 or so. began a certain understanding of the scriptures, and he wanted to begin to expand his understanding of them. So he started a Bible study in, I think it was Pittsburgh, I believe. At some point, it gets moved. The headquarters gets moved to New York. But he and another man, his name was N.H. Barber. Yeah, N.H. Barber. They founded a magazine called Herald of the Morning. And then that later got changed to the Watchtower Announcing Jehovah's Kingdom. And they founded what's called the Zion's Watchtower Tract Society. And today it is known as the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Okay, that's the official name of the group, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. So, let's talk about some beliefs, some particular beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses. It'd take too long to go through everything they believe, but I just want to point out some of the more relevant ones for us. Number one, what do they believe about God? They do not believe in a Trinitarian God, so they deny the Trinity. Okay, God is not infinite and eternal in the same way that the true God is. Jesus is not God. Jesus is the archangel Michael, who took on human form, okay, in the form of Jesus. So that's who they believe Jesus is. Salvation is through a combination of good works. They believe only a few, 144,000, will spend forever in heaven with God. This is a limited number. That doesn't mean that, because you say, well, there's more than 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses. What happens to the rest of them? The rest will live on an earthly paradise. Okay? Those who are true witnesses of Jehovah. So they believe that Adam and Eve fell, and I believe, as far as I remember, they don't actually think Adam and Eve are redeemed. So they're not true witnesses of Jehovah. They fell, but there's been true witnesses of Jehovah through history. Noah, Abraham, Moses, and then all the way up to Charles Taze Russell. Let's see. There's a belief that Jesus came back invisibly in the year 1914 and has been reigning and ruling the kingdom ever since then. Okay, they have a particular idiosyncratic views that you might be familiar with. They don't agree with blood transfusions. They don't celebrate birthdays, holidays. They don't speak of their earthly fathers. They don't call them father. They usually call them by their first name. Okay, so if you ever, I remember I had a Jehovah's Witness guy that I worked with, and they would talk about this kind of stuff, like, we're not supposed to call anyone father, so they reference their dad just by their first name. I think that's why, if you ever see interviews with Michael Jackson, I think he did this. He called his father by his first name. I remember being, that's kind of weird. Why did he call him by his first name? So let me pause there for a moment, see what questions just initially might come up. Or have any thoughts or questions about any of that? Adam?
Where did the 1914 date? How did they land?
Yeah, you're gonna press my memory banks now. It was, I believe it had to do with the weeks in mentioned. Is it Daniel? And they added that on to a date they believe Jerusalem fell, but I don't remember why, but for some reason they think it fell in like 607. So they have a kind of a different date for when Jerusalem fell than I think most people would agree upon. And then they added the number of weeks and I think it's Daniel, unless I'm misremembering. And then it gets to 1914. No. Something didn't happen in 1914, and they say, oh, that must have been Jesus coming back. It's based on, a certain understanding of the text. Like many groups, they have very specialized interpretation of the text. And if you aren't familiar with it, you can get very lost in it, right? Like you just kind of get carried along and say, well, that sounds interesting, that sounds interesting, that sounds interesting. Next thing you know, you're agreeing with their conclusions. Yeah, or something else I was going to add on that. Yes?
Is there sort of a certain mathematical deadline that they're up against and some nervousness about whether it's going to happen or not happen?
So yeah, they've definitely made some predictions, I believe, that have come and gone, right? That they, as apologists, they have to deal with. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I remember hearing about that in the past. But not. I think in the 1914 one, though, I think that was in particularly in connection with working backwards. But yeah, I believe they made certain predictions for future events that have not happened. So if this is happening in the late 1800s, so 1890s-ish is when it's becoming popular. But I also have, one thing I should say too, is they have kind of a living prophetic word that continues on. It's like we mentioned earlier today. And it's kind of like an angel inspired prophetic word. So they have a current leadership that can tell you, new revelation, new interpretations of things. Yeah. I saw another hand. Yes.
I was just curious, you mentioned that they believed that Abraham, Moses, some others. So by their estimate, 144,000, think back, how many of those 144,000 were Jews who were actually, they were considered a Jehovah's Witnesses
Yeah.
before they formed the religion?
Yeah. So the question was, how many of the 144,000 previously were Jews? What's interesting is, if I understand correctly, I believe the 144,000 are those who have to be alive at the coming of Jehovah, at the end of time. And so that raises another natural question. Well, wait a second, aren't there going to be more than 144,000 current, living, active Jehovah's Witnesses becomes? It says, yeah, but only 144,000 of them are going to be true witnesses of Jehovah. So I believe anyone in the past who's died is not going to be in that group. I think they have to be currently ones who are alive. But yeah. So what are some of the central problems then with Jehovah's Witnesses? Well, first, and why do we identify them as a cult? Well, remember, cults are those kind of aberrant Christian groups, something that come out of a broadly Christian worldview, but distort an essential doctrine, at least one, if not many. Okay, and not only have we seen that here, if you remember a couple weeks ago when we did the list of the heresies, Christian heresies, you actually see a number of those rejected specifically by Jehovah's Witnesses. So, for example, what are some central problems they have? Well, one, they deny the doctrine of the Trinity. Okay, so they deny the deity of the Holy Spirit. Okay, they're strict monotheists. They deny the deity of Christ. Okay, they deny the physical resurrection. We didn't talk about that one yet, but they believe that Christ just rose spiritually, not physically. His body decayed. So what is that? Which of the heresies does that sound like? Maybe appeared to be a physical resurrection, but was not physical. So there's a certain heresy that says Jesus appeared physical, but Docetism, right? Yeah, Docetism, all right? A certain Gnosticism I might see in there too, like matter is evil, the spirit's good, matter's bad. They also believe salvation. They reject salvation by grace through faith. It's an admixture of works. So the natural question is then, strategically, how should we approach Jehovah's Witnesses? You're probably, just practically, you're probably less likely to encounter Jehovah's Witnesses than, let's say, probably Mormons, especially here in Arizona. But I think the lessons you can take from evangelizing and preparing yourself to deal with Jehovah's Witnesses would translate to many others as well. So the first is, of course, we'll always mention a very person-centered evangelistic approach. Addressing this person where they're at, again, they may be unaware of certain views, although Jehovah's Witnesses are required to attend a certain Bible studies where they kind of continue to get indoctrinated in how the church interprets things. So they tend to be a little bit more well-versed, at least in their view of how they understand certain scriptures. Once you get outside of that, then it becomes more problematic. But also, something I haven't mentioned yet, but kind of a doxological approach to evangelism. What do I mean by that? So a God-honoring approach to evangelism. I think that means at least two things come to mind. Number one is the means by which you evangelize, the attitude you have with someone. Okay, not just viewing this person as like a box to check, a number to bring in, something like that, a person to overcome. We are to destroy arguments and speculations that raise themselves up against the knowledge of God. That's true. But the person who's raising them is not the same thing as the argument, the view itself. So we address this person. I tend to think of this person, hey, what if God's going to use this opportunity to redeem this person, and this person is going to be a future brother or sister in Christ in a matter of months? Try to view them that way, as opposed to this is like an enemy who I'm trying to destroy and defeat them. In the same way that we were redeemed, right? Not because of how good we are, but because of how good God is. And the other part of the doxological approach is, I think, just trusting in the work of the Spirit, which means you don't trust in your abilities. You don't get overcome with, Greg, how am I ever going to learn all this stuff about all these cults and all these groups? There's no way I'm going to learn all this stuff. How am I going to know all these things before I go out and evangelize? I can't go out and evangelize until I learn all this stuff? No, I'm not saying that. There's always stuff to learn. And then when you learn it, guess what? You're going to forget it. So unless you spent like 10 hours a day constantly going over these things, but it's okay, because if you get in a discussion and you get to a point where you don't remember something, you're not quite sure what to say, that's okay. The onus is not on you anyways. And when you get very stressful and think like, if I don't say something, this person's not going to get saved. No, that's not a doxological view. It's not trusting in the Lord and his work. Okay? Yes?
About 20 years ago, I saw a Paul Washer video. He was a missionary out in the field a lot. And he approached it by asking them what they thought might be get saved, and just, reaffirmed with them several times. So you're saying you believe this 3 or 4 times, and then he went to 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 6, and read that to them, and, then they said, but you said this, this is what the scripture says. No, your New World Translation translates that passage the same way as our Bibles do.
I think it doesn't actually, yeah.
That seemed to, for him, that he said that worked very successfully because he was just affirming what they said they believed and then confronting them with what the scriptures said.
Yeah. Particularly with Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Yeah. That's interesting. Did you guys notice the pattern there? So those of you who have been in our Bible studies will catch that, right? Ask questions, right? So we've talked a lot about how to engage with people, and I've been an encourager of asking questions largely. That's the baptismal over there, so if you're wondering what that sound is. Asking questions first to find out what they believe. And we said that does a number of things. One of the things is it solidifies what they believe so you can come back to it later. And then finally, at the last stage, you can move on to, well, this seems to say this. What do you think about this? And you're showing the contradiction, again, through asking questions. So, yeah, a great example of that. I love it. A second thing is to address the epistemology. This goes with everyone, but particularly with the Jehovah's Witnesses, because their understanding of how to interpret certain scriptures is going to come largely because of this is how they've been taught to do it. That, and coupled with the authoritative teaching of the Watchtower Society. So like any other authoritative source, you can question and ask, how do you know that they're to be trusted? But I think the third one, particularly with Jehovah's Witnesses, but really with anybody, is you just have to know Christian theology well. Just know what historic Christianity teaches, one, what it teaches, and two, why it teaches it. And if you're well-versed in that, and it's like you're going to be able to overcome many of the efforts from cultic groups, because I think they tend to prey on those who are like nominally familiar with Christian theology and the scriptures. And a lot of times, if you give off the hey, I've actually studied these things and I kind of am familiar with this stuff, they'll often, all right, see you later. that's from experience, and I think even that's a bit of what they're taught. Like, just don't mess around with the people who want to. Now they might put it pejoratively. Like, don't mess around with the people who want to wrangle with words with you, or something like that, right? Or those who want to cause problems, or just be argumentative. Right? But that could just be anybody who presents a different idea or a counter argument, right? So, and one example of that, which I think is kind of fun, is if you get a chance. We've talked about with Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, other groups. It largely, now there's many false beliefs they have, but they almost always center around the person of Christ. There's no Trinity. Jesus is not God. He's something else. Spirit brother of Lucifer, Michael the Archangel, something else. So if you can focus in on the person and work of Christ, that's going to help a lot. It's going to help a lot, okay? So I can recommend some books to you, because what's going to happen is you're going to run into a Jehovah's Witness, and they're going to want to talk to you about John 1:1, and we're doing our series on John, right? So they might take you there and they say, hey, this verse should actually be translated that Jesus was a God, not Jesus was God, right? And if you're unfamiliar with that, you're kind of like, oh, I don't know, why is that? And they say, well, there's no article here, and so we have to put it in. But the truth of the matter is, when you really begin to study John 1:1 and following with someone who's knowledgeable, I'm not saying you have to take like a Greek class or anything. You just get a book on, the Trinity, or I think like James White's book on the Forgotten Trinity is nice to use for some of these kind of things. And you just read about the what's being taught there in John 1 through really 14 and on down through 18, and you're like, wow, this is amazing stuff. This is incredible. Like down to the words that are being chosen, the different verb forms, and why is there an article before this word and not before this one? And like I said, I'm not going to get into all these details now, but when you read about it, you're like, this is incredible stuff. And sometimes a little bit missed in our English translations. Not that they're not reliable, but sometimes you just miss some of the nuances that then when you learn it, not only is it edifying to you, it's helpful when you're talking to somebody else. Okay? Yeah.
Do Jehovah's Witnesses believe in any type of corruption of the Bible, or is it just our misinterpretation?
Yes, and yes. So needs to be interpreted properly, right? And they have their own translation called the New World Translation, I believe. And what's interesting, though, is there's actually whole books and pamphlets you can get on evangelizing them, even with that translation. So, like, you can still show the deity of Christ and all the essential Christian doctrines. Like, put it this way, they didn't change enough. They didn't tweak it enough. Which we would expect, right? Like, I mean, the Gospels, they just scream the deity of Christ, right? And so it'd be really difficult to get the deity of Christ eliminated out. So I think, if I remember correctly, I think that guy's name was Ron Rhodes, I think. He did a series of books called Reasoning from Blank with the Scriptures. And he has one on Mormonism, has one on Jehovah's Witness, has one on Islam. I think it's the name of the series. And I always found those kind of helpful. So those are nice. And then usually the people who are pretty into that world, some of the main counter-cult apologists, like I mentioned, James White, guys like that, they become very skillful at using even that translation to show the deity of Christ. But then you might get into discussions about that, the corruption of the text. And that's going to be the same as we do with any group. Mormonism, Islam. Well, I think we mentioned before is they think similar to Mormonism, there's been a true church this whole time. It's just, and usually everyone wants to claim, like, you want to claim Moses, you want to claim Abraham, guys like that. Even Islam does that, right? It's like everyone, they were all on our side originally, They're secret. They're actually Jehovah's Witnesses this whole time. They're actually, Muslims this whole time. So usually there's some story of like it was there, but kind of hard to see and corrupted, and then something happens to some person, whether it's an angel or God himself comes and tells a person, Muhammad, Joseph Smith, Russell, hey, things have gone corrupted. I need you to reset it, and here's some maybe new revelation, or you're going to be my spokesperson. I mean, it's kind of like a similar pattern, right, over and over again. Yeah. Yes.
To answer that question, the Jehovah's Witnesses are restorationists, so they believe that the true church disappeared and that they're restoring it. So they believe that all other churches, similar to Joseph Smith, all other churches, when Charles Taze Russell was receiving his prophecy, were corrupt.
Right, yeah. Yeah. So not individual. There's still Jehovah's Witnesses individuals, but there was no active, there was no one church you could go to and say, that church still has it. Right? So yeah, saw the same thing with Mormons. Yeah.
But add to, your talk about if you know too much, they'll blacklist you.
Yeah.
They do.
Yeah.
If you're an ex-Jehovah Witness, they blacklist you immediately. Basically, that's to tell all their, so they have a chart, or they used to, of all the neighborhoods and all the people that are blacklisted, so they don't waste their time.
Right, yeah.
That's the point.
Yep. Same thing with discussion forums. If you go in there and you try to talk in a discussion forums and you answer to their objections, or you raise certain things, you'll just get booted. You won't be allowed to participate. Which is interesting. I think that one of the things that we could be proud of as Christians is if you believe you have the truth on your side, you want discussion. Like, we want discussion. We want to invite, like, the bigger the round table, the more public, the better, right? Because we're not afraid. We don't need to hide. We're not saying anything like some hidden knowledge and in secret, and you can only get it through coming to this thing. So that's something to be, praise God for. All right. Well, again, there's some many resources out there that you can continue to look into this. If it's something that you find particularly interesting, Jehovah's Witnesses. But as I said, I'll reiterate, the main thing I would hope that this series, after every group we talk about, encourages you to do is, man, I need to know my own stuff better. Like, I need to know how I got the Bible. Why do I think Jesus is God? How do I know the Trinity is true? How do I respond to some objections? Because honestly, the objections are like pretty much the same. Like Mormons, Jehovah's Witness, Muslim, Oneness, Pentecostal, you're going to get all the same objections. Why does Jesus pray to somebody if he's God? How can God die? How can he not know things? It's the same stuff over and over again. So when you learn it, you can then apply it to